welcome to our first bell lecture of the spring semester. I'm Captain B.J. Armstrong, the Principal Associate of the Forum on Integrated Naval History and Seapower Studies here at the Naval Academy. This lecture series is a joint initiative between the History Department and the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. The Stockdale Center serves as a valuable resource to the Naval Academy and its students and aims to empower leaders that make courageous ethical decisions. FINHSS, or the Forum on Integrated Naval History and Seapower Studies, is an effort by the History Department at USNA. We founded FINHSS a couple of years ago to help develop our collective understanding of naval history and of sea power, and to encourage collaboration in the wider field of interdisciplinary sea power studies. We both, the Stockdale Center and FINHSS, would like to thank William C. Stutt, USNA class of 1949, for the generous donation that supports this lecture series and support from the Naval Academy Foundation as well. Today we are joined by John Sherwood. Dr. Sherwood is a historian with the Naval History and Heritage Command, which is the U.S. Navy's official history branch. He holds a Ph.D. in history from George Washington University and has authored 7 books on military and naval topics. His most recent book, A Global Force for Good, Sea Services Humanitarian Operations in the 21st Century, examines recent disaster relief operations. His book, War in the Shallows, won the North American Society for Oceanic History's John Lyman Award for the best naval history published that year. Sherwood serves as the co-host of the Preble Hall podcast with the USNA Museum as well. So in today's talk, we're going to hear about the leadership requirements of humanitarian operations in the 21st century and a little bit about the Sea Service's peacetime missions and responsibilities. Dr. Sherwood.
So thank you, Captain Armstrong, Major Scoville, the History Department at the Naval Academy, and the Stockdale Center for hosting this event. Today I'm going to be discussing leadership in humanitarian operations. It is based on the research that I did for my book. Next slide, please. So the book began in 2017. It was identified as a gap in the naval literature by a gap study that was conducted by the Naval History and Heritage Command. I was also influenced by my work on the Vietnam War. There were quite a few humanitarian actions there. Probably some of the most famous include Frequent Wind, the evacuation of Saigon, but even before that, Passage to Freedom after the first Indochina War. That was a massive movement of people, but there are also medcaps by naval medical personnel, CB civic action programs, so building schools, bridges, and government buildings. And for this book, I have 3 case studies. I wanted to focus my research on what I call the apogee of Sea Services humanitarianism. So those are the years 2005 through 2011. These are the years that the Navy came out with its cooperative strategy for 21st sea power, which is called CS21. And CS21 is unique as a capstone paper because it defined humanitarian operations as a core Navy mission. It was also the period when the advertising slogan, A Global Force for Good, came out. That was in 2009. And some of the biggest operations included Unified Assistance, that was in Indonesia in 2005, the Navy response to Katrina, also in 2005, Tomodachi, 2011, and also Haiti. Today I'm going to focus mainly on Tomodachi. That was the most complex of my operations that I cover, but I'll also talk about leadership in some of the other operations as well. Next slide, please. So climate change is a growing problem in the world. With our natural disasters are a growing problem with climate change. Over 32 million people have perished since 1900, and 1900 is the date where modern records exist. The 32 disasters have killed over 100,000 people. The 2005 earthquake and tsunami in Southeast Asia killed 165,000. The Haiti earthquake in 2010 killed 220,000. By comparison, Katrina, only a little over 1,800 people died. And in Japan, during its triple disaster, 19,000. A lot of this has to do with the developed world being more prepared for disaster relief. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to Tomodachi. But the flip side of the coin is that these disasters are much more costly in the developed world. So some of the most expensive operations, or disasters rather, are Katrina, 165 billion, and the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami, 241 billion. Next slide, please. So not only does the Navy often have to deal with, or DoD, with the disasters themselves, but all of the secondary effects. These disasters can metastasize and cause all sorts of other problems, ranging from industrial accidents, that's Fukushima, unauthorized migration, fires, airfield and port closures, so interruptions to supply chains, oil leaks, oil spills, disease, famine, lawlessness, and even war. And as a historic side note, the Navy's greatest peacetime loss, does anyone know when that occurred? Honda Point, Santa Barbara, California. 7 destroyers went aground. That was in 1923. Navigation errors were part of the reason that happened, but a larger reason is that in 1923 there was a huge earthquake in Japan called the Great Kanto earthquake, and that disrupted ocean conditions and currents all the way to Santa Barbara, California. That earthquake killed 140,000 people. The US Navy responded, even though it was a tense period for Japanese-American relations. And last year, Japan honored that, the 100th anniversary of that event, and the US Navy featured prominently in a lot of its media on that anniversary. So the goodwill that the Navy receives from these operations pays dividends over many, many, many years. Next slide, please. So why does the US military often have to respond? Don't we have NGOs, the UN, the Red Cross? And the answer is yes. And there are many disasters every month, every week that occur throughout the world. Just this week, there are fires in Chile. There's flooding in California, mudslides in California. The DoD doesn't respond to all these disasters, but when the big one occurs, when you have a 9-level earthquake or a huge volcanic eruption or tsunami, often, in many cases, only the US military, it's the only entity that has the capability to respond in some of these remote parts of the world. It's forward deployed, and that made a huge difference in Tomodachi. With the Indonesian earthquake, there was a carrier strike group, the Abraham Lincoln Strike Group, that was in Hong Kong, and the head of that CSG was a guy named Doug Crowder. Doug Crowder is United States Naval Academy, 1974, and he had the wherewithal to cancel Liberty, knowing that the people in Hong Kong, knowing that his CSG might have to go to Indonesia, and sure enough, it did. And he was instrumental we had no military relationship with the Indonesians at that time. And So he had to forge a military relationship and also run a disaster relief. So it takes leadership, but why the military? The military has all these capabilities we talk about: airlift and air mobility, sea lift, expeditionary capability, medical, construction, engineering, power generation, and last but certainly not least, the talents of American service personnel. So the US sailor, the US Marine has on a ship, those folks have all of the special occupations that one might find in a mid-sized city. They're young, they're healthy, so they can respond. Next slide, please. Foreign disaster response, I mentioned 1923 Canto response as being a watershed. An even earlier example of humanitarian action was the Great White Fleet's response to the 1908 Messina earthquake and tsunami. But as Captain Armstrong, I'm sure, would tell you, Navy humanitarianism goes all the way back to the age of sail. It can be as small as rendering aid to mariners in distress, to seeing refugees and giving them some food. That's all humanitarian in its nature. Now, some of the laws that have had an effect on foreign disaster response are the Economic Recovery Act of 1947, so the Marshall Plan, the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, which created the USAID, among other agencies, and the DoD Directive 51.46, as amended, first issued in 1974, that provides the DoD authority to act. And basically what that directive says is that in a foreign disaster response, DoD and its agencies can respond, but in 72 hours, they have to notify the State Department, and the State Department is going to be the lead agency. And I go back to Doug Crowder. He has a funny story about the ambassador calling him Len Pascoe, and he says, "Doug, I've got 2 questions for you, and you better pass, or we're going to have trouble." And Doug goes, "Sure, what is it, sir?" "Whose country is this?" "Why, sir, it's the Indonesians' country." "Good answer." Second question, "Who's in charge here?" "Well, sir, that's you." "Great answer. We're going to get along fine." So, but DoD Directive 5100.46 provides that authority. Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus a little bit more closely on Tomodachi, and one of the things I want to point out in this slide is that red line that goes all the way down the coast of eastern Honshu, and then that red dot. The red dot was the earthquake, 9.0, and that line is the extent of the tsunami, okay? Over 200 miles of tsunami. And some of those waves were 40 meters, so 120 feet. So how tall is this building? Okay, we're talking waves that size. Next slide, please. With Japan, Japan is one of the most developed countries in the world. It's also one of the most prepared countries in the world. Every Japanese town has a disaster response plan. Every Japanese town has disaster supplies, has a designated landing zone for helicopters, has volunteers who are trained on how to unload a helicopter, when you go to the helicopter, you don't just take what they give you, you ask them what they have, and you only take what you need. They also have some of the highest construction standards in the world. They build seawalls to protect their coastal communities. They have disaster response drills where everybody goes to the high ground if there's a tsunami warning. And that's if you're an exchange student there, that's on the coast, that's one of the first things they teach you. And all of the essential services in these communities are built on high ground. So you have the school, the fire department, medical facilities typically on the high ground. Not in every case, but in most cases. Nonetheless, when the big one hits, no amount of preparation can fully prepare you. And in Japan, it was the tsunami that killed most people. And when the Navy responded, one of the first things that they wanted our helicopter pilots, our P3 crews, our EC2 people to look for were survivors, because the dead have an honorable position in Japanese society. It was actually more important to look for the dead and recover the dead than deal with the living in Japan. That shocked a lot of our naval personnel, but it's their country, as Doug Crowder would say, and so we did as we were told. But with tsunamis, whether it's Indonesia, whether it's Japan, you're not going to find a lot of people. The tsunamis, for whatever reason, sort of suck people, to the ocean floor, and there are very, very few remains. Next slide. So I am not a nuclear engineer. I am not a power school graduate. Did anyone attend power school, nuclear power school? It's the toughest program in the Navy, okay. At least that's what all of my interviewees said. Many of them are graduates of the War College, PG School, Naval Academy. So Fukushima, 6 reactors. It was built by a consortium consisting of Mitsubishi, Hitachi, and the American company General Electric. It was built at a time when there wasn't as much understanding of disasters. The seawall was only good for a 5.7 meter tsunami, and what happened was they received a 10-meter tsunami. When the earthquake occurred, everything was going well. The plant went into shutdown mode, and shutting down a power plant like this is not an on-off, it's a long process. And then the cooling began, but then about 40 minutes later, when the tsunami hit, it inundated the emergency diesel generators, which were unfortunately on the lower decks of the reactor buildings, and they had a loss of power. Loss of power meant hydrogen explosions and the beginnings of meltdown for some of the reactors. So I'll talk about how Japan and the United States responded. It was mostly Japan. But you'll look at that picture. Those are water barges that the US Navy lent the Japanese. And actually, a fellow class of 1999 person, Derek Peterson, who was the head of salvage, really very interesting gentleman, he wanted to be detached from the Navy, go up with the Japan Self-Defense Forces, and basically supervise the whole pumping of water into the reactors. The JSDF, to its credit, said, no, if someone's going to die for their country, it's going to be us. But we'd appreciate your expertise, and we appreciate you telling us how to work these pumps and being available to answer questions. So it's not only the barges, but pumps from the salvage and survey locker, I believe it was Sasebo. So it was ultimately pumping fresh water and some salt water, unfortunately, with airport fire trucks, some of which were lent by the DoD, and also concrete trucks, the trucks that pump concrete, and restoring some of the power to the plant and to the systems that ultimately brought this thing under control. But there was a time when Navy leaders in Tokyo thought that we were getting, the Navy has a nuclear response cell in Japan, and who was constantly modeling the situation. And there was a point when TEPCO moved all of its people out of the plant, and there was a feeling that they had lost control and that a good swath of Honshu was going to be lost, including the Tokyo metropolitan area. And so the Navy was planning that maybe we'd have to evacuate not only our people, but a large number of Japanese as well. Next slide, please. So, US and Japan, in natural disasters, they can occur in countries where we essentially have no military relationship, like Indonesia, or they can occur in Japan, where we have a status of forces agreement, we have bases, we have a treaty of mutual cooperation and security. It's much easier to surge forward in a situation like Japan than Indonesia. And managing that relationship, one of the more difficult jobs, leadership jobs, is the US Forces Japan. And during Tomodachi, it was a US Air Force Academy graduate, Burt Field. And then ultimately, it was decided that they needed a bit more horsepower. They needed someone with 4 stars. So Pat Walsh, who is the Pac Fleet commander, also a Naval Academy commander, was brought in. And there were no hard feelings between Field and Pat Walsh. It was a seamless transition, and Field commanded at the beginning, Walsh in the middle, Field at the end. And one of the highest compliments I kept getting about Field was all of these admirals were saying, he's a terrific officer, you have to interview him, because I wasn't planning to interview an Air Force officer. So that's him with General Oriki, Chief of Staff of the Japan Self-Defense Force. So next slide. So the US response was multifaceted, but I'll just talk about some of the larger elements. The Reagan Carrier Strike Group was not home ported in Japan at this period. It was a GW, but it was backfilling for GW, which was in maintenance at the time. And when this whole thing occurred, GW had to be taken out of a maintenance status and moved south. That was another Herculean task, not only for the crew, but contractors and even survey and salvage divers. But Reagan responded. They were on the East Coast, they were near the East Coast, and they detected radiation almost as soon as they entered the scene. But rather than just saying, hey, we can't do this, Tom Burke, who was the captain and who had gone to nuclear power school, was convinced after discussing the matter with his staff and also folks up the chain of command that the Navy could fight through this, that the Navy could operate in a radiological contaminated environment. And so this is a live fire exercise for the Navy working in a contaminated environment. And what the Reagan did is it pulled out of the plume. They monitored the plume so they weren't going to steam into the plume, and then took efforts to remediate the radiation. So air crews that were coming in, the helicopters had to be decontaminated, the decks had to be decontaminated, equipment had to be decontaminated. The pilots complained that they were losing articles of clothing and some very hard to get clothing like boots and that sort of thing. Next slide. The Marines did not initially steam up the East Coast. The Essex Expeditionary Strike Group went west, but eventually moved east. They were able to respond to Oshima Island, and the Marines, unlike the Navy has to use, for the most part, had to use helicopters to move supplies to the shore. The Marines could actually move a lot of its people and a lot of heavy equipment ashore, which was needed because this island was completely flattened by the tsunami, and they had to get rid of debris so that the island could receive relief supplies. One of the things about the Marine Corps is, at the time, all the press in Japan was negative about the Marine Corps. Whenever you saw the Marine Corps in the press, it was because a Marine had done something bad. At Oshima Island, the Marine Corps completely redeemed itself. It showed, first of all, the first thing it did is it performed an honorary ceremony called a makuto. It was to respect the dead. They stood at attention, and there was a moment of silence for the dead. That floored the Japanese because no other visitors to the island after the event had done that. The other thing that impressed the islanders was how careful they were about trying to salvage anything of value for the people, asking permission before they would go in and demolish a house. I should also mention that's Sendai International Airport. Marine engineers, Navy Seabees, and Air Force Special Operations did the impossible. The Japanese thought that airport would never open in time for any relief supplies to arrive, but this group of military were able to get the fields open. Once they arrived, in 24 hours, they could land C-130s, and not long after that, they could land larger transport planes. Okay, next slide. I mentioned that the Navy was both a victim and a first responder. The former superintendent of the Naval Academy, Vice Admiral Buck, was in Mazawa, visiting his airmen, and he experienced the earthquake right there. It was not terribly far from the epicenter. It lasted 5 minutes. Has anyone ever been in an earthquake? How long did it last? How long? 2 or 3 minutes. That's a big one. You're from California. So how would you feel if you were standing and there was an earthquake that lasted 5 minutes, and the pavement was starting to ripple like a wave, and you couldn't get any perspective on the horizon? So people were actually starting to get motion sick. Sean Buck said he doesn't get motion sick, but he actually experienced a little bit of motion sickness. So that tells you what kind of an event. But a lot of our bases, as you saw from that image, were pretty far south, Tokyo area, and further south. Those folks were like Californians. They, 6.0 earthquake, who cares? Once it's finished, we get back to work. So they didn't realize the extent of it immediately. Next, one last thing. So we didn't have to evacuate all dependents. We didn't have to evacuate Japanese, but we did organize a military-assisted voluntary evacuation, and 5,000, mostly women with children, pregnant women, people who were in vulnerable groups, they could leave if they wanted to, and most were encouraged to leave. And they then came back. Next slide. Okay, so the foreign relations impact of these operations is huge. In Japan, up until 2011, there was a large swath of the Japanese population that not only was anti-military, but wanted the U.S. military to leave Japan, period. They also felt that Japan itself didn't need a military. And that's coming out of World War II and Japanese imperialism and their history. Case in point, Admiral Walsh class of 1977 is sitting with Japan Defense Minister Toshimi Kitazawa. Kitazawa, as a student, went out and protested, as a college student, went out and protested the 1960 treaty, defense treaty between the U.S. and Japan. And when his government was elected, and he was appointed defense minister, there was a feeling of, oh no, they're going to request that the U.S. start closing some of its bases and moving some of our people out of Japan. Here is Kitazawa on the Reagan, on a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, personally thanking the head of the U.S. effort. In schools, this is a picture of Mary Robinson, Lieutenant JG at the time, now a commander, helicopter pilot, she HSL 51, and Robinson told me that before the tsunami at Atsugi, they would go to restaurants, her and her squadron mates, and they would get this, which is no gaijin, no American military, you're not allowed, you're not welcome here. After the tsunami, they had to refuse all the offers they were getting for free beer. They were invited to schools. They were asked to give speeches. So complete change in mindset. And the same is true with Indonesia. Indonesia is the world's most populous Muslim country. And before our actions there, the U.S. was not the flavor of the month, I'll put it that way. But afterwards, the support for the U.S. and skyrocketed. So these operations can have a tremendous impact, sometimes a greater impact than the U.S. Navy has in a kinetic operation. Not always, but sometimes. The next slide. In these disaster responses, one of the things that Doug Crowder, Patrick Walsh, and others talk about is the Navy can't just come in and take over and say, this is our operation, everybody else go suck on an egg. It's important, operating in foreign countries, that the foreign military is seen as the face of the operation. And with the Japan Self-Defense Force, we were okay with them not only being the face of the operation, but leading the operation. It was their first coalition operation in their history. Over 100,000 personnel were mobilized, including all 60 ships of the Maritime Self-Defense Force and about 500 fixed and rotary aircraft. And they demonstrated their heroism, not only fighting fires in Kisanuma, but also fighting radiation at Fukushima. And they lived up to their oath. They're one of the few armed forces in the world that has an oath where you basically swear to give your life for the country. The oath is, I swear with my own body to perform my duty without regard to danger. So they demonstrated their self-worth to the Japanese. Next slide. I want to leave some room for Q&A, so I'm going to just breeze through these. Some of the leaders and their stories that I talk about. Derek Peterson is in the lower right-hand side. Captain Burke of the Reagan. That's Admiral Bob Guerrier, class of 1983. Bob Guerrier told me a really funny story, and that is he was on a Japanese ship meeting with a counterpart when this happened, and he got back to the ship, and he went back to his cabin, and knock, knock, knock on his door. An engineering lab technician enlisted comes to him and says, sir, I gotta do a radiation check, no problem. And the enlisted ELT says, sir, I want you to take off all your clothes. and put them in this bag. And then I want you to go into the shower and scrub very hard every part of your body. So only in the US Navy can an enlisted ELT tell the Carrier Strike Group commander to do something, and he will do it if it's a reasonable request. But he tells that story about how, in the Navy, everybody is important. We trust everybody up and down the chain of command. Next slide, please. Some of the other people I've spoken with, Doug Crowder in Indonesia with his Indonesian counterpart, General Bambang Duramo. There is Vice Admiral Nora Tyson, then captain on Bataan. Bataan was the first responder, first Navy ship in for Katrina. And she's unfortunately not a Naval Academy graduate, but the guy next to her is Admiral Mullen, class of 1968. He was the CNO at the time. He visited, and he said he's a SWO, and he said, I know when I enter a ship if it's a good ship. And when I came aboard Bataan, I knew immediately that this was a good ship. And because of that meeting, and Nora Tyson jokes, during that meeting, John, I told him it was basically an S show. She was very honest with him. But anyway, as a result of that meeting, after she left Bataan, she went to Admiral Mullen's staff and ultimately got a star and ultimately retired as the head of a numbered fleet, Second Fleet, the first woman to command a numbered fleet. Next slide. And so if you want the book unfortunately is still at the printers, but the digital copy has been released in PDF. Lots of good pictures, lots of good stories, and you can get it through the QDR. I'm going to stop right here, and if people have questions. John.
One question I have is on the reception of the Navy and military's efforts here after Katrina. And I know you must have focused on Japan and mentioned Indonesia a little bit, but for the domestic audience and seeing how our military did with Katrina versus how the response in Japan to the foreign Navy, the U.S. Navy's response there, any continuities, or were there big differences, or what's your sense of factors that?
Well, with the helicopter, there are a few helicopter pilots who were in both operations for one reason or another, and it was stark, the contrast between how the Japanese behaved when receiving relief supplies and how the Americans behaved. The Japanese were well organized. They would only take what they needed. It was complete chaos with Katrina. The other aspect of Katrina was the U.S. military needed force protection because of posse comitatus. We can't carry guns on U.S. soil, so we actually needed protection from the National Guard, or in some cases law enforcement, to go into certain areas in New Orleans. So that was never an issue in Japan. Now, it was an issue in Indonesia. There was an active insurgency there that we were worried about. And we were worried about not being perceived as being on one side or another. So Admiral Crowder has a good story about chewing out one of his intelligence people for collecting intel from the helicopter during the operation. He said, we can't do that because if we do that, we're going to get kicked out or worse. So, yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if the Navy or Marine Corps respond to every natural disaster, like that they feasibly can around the world, like every significant one, or how much do you call to play into it, and whether we need that country to gain better interest in us and gain favor from us?
So I look at the apogee of humanitarianism in the military, where it was a core mission where we were actively engaged in a wide variety of these humanitarian missions. But even then, there was a debate, quite a debate, between Admiral Nathman, who was Fleet Forces Command, and Admiral Mullen about the extent to which the Navy and the Marine Corps should be involved in the Katrina response. The military has all these capabilities, but the capabilities are designed to defend the country and our country's interests, not to be a humanitarian provider. So there's typically a lot of resistance throughout the chain of command to these operations, because like the Carrier Strike Group, the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, while these helicopter missions are being performed, the fixed wing aviators start to lose their currency. They're not getting the traps, they're not getting the night traps, those types of things. So you're losing, your effectiveness is being bled out during these operations. I mean, you're working with allies, you're gaining certain skills, but you're losing skill, you're losing muscle mass as well. And ships are on tight schedules. I mean, the Lincoln had to be in the Middle East. So it's a constant tug of war, and it's usually only when a big event occurs that completely, 165,000 people are dead, and there are no resources that the U.S. Navy might have to get involved. The same with domestic response. It's Title 10 forces. It's really a 911 in the it's a last response. The first response should be local authorities, the local military. Does that answer your question?
Sir, does it depend at all on like the country that had a natural disaster, if we want them to be an ally or if we want to gain influence with them? Or does that play into whether we decide it?
Typically, no. So we were essentially in an adversarial role with the Japanese in 1923, and yet we responded to the Great Kanto earthquake. Yes, Indonesia is an important country. It's the world's most populous Muslim country, but we responded there because they were in dire need, not necessarily because we wanted to, win friends and influence people. That's a bonus, but in my research, I never saw that as the motivation to go in and perform disaster relief. In Japan, we were there already. Haiti, over 200,000 people are dead. They're our next door neighbor. Yes, sir.
Hey, John. Chris Costello from the History Department. When you said that the genesis of your work was NHHC looking at kind of a gap in the literature, was that driven by NHHC, or did the fleet kind of come to NHHC and say, we'd like to know more about our history of HADR, nothing's out there, what do you got? And then you said to...
The gap study was an attempt to figure out as an agency where we should focus our resources. So HADR was just one aspect of naval history that was identified as a gap. OIF, OEF were identified as gaps as well. We still haven't written histories of those operations. So, yeah, history of women from tailhook to the present. Those are some of the. So it was social topics, operational, force structure. It's online if you want to take a look at it.
Is there a feedback mechanism now to the fleet? So you've done this great work, and can you push it back out, like push it to the schoolhouses, so that there's kind of this institutional learning of mixing kind of the side of what NHHC is doing, and the fleet can see the value of its historical experience, or is there a bit of a gap there?
We have to promote our own books, and what helps is if the books are free. So I found out, I was up at the War College talking about this book, and I found out that one of the professors had been assigning one of my other books for 3 years, War in the Shallows, and one of the reasons he did that is because it was free and downloadable. So yeah, the author has to do some work, the agency does some work. It's a struggle.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're about out of time. The shipment have to get to class, so join me in thanking Dr. Sherwood. And stay tuned to your emails for our next FINHSS event later in the semester. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.